This is the third recording, the third audio. Week 3, lecture 1. Let's start again. Week 3, lecture 1, third audio. Looking at slide 18. So since I've studied this a lot, and I've also studied the background history, I wanted to point out how the differences between the way KMT intelligence was organized and CCP intelligence was organized actually reflected some positive and negative characteristics of not only Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, but also how it reflected the way their parties worked or didn't work in the course of the Chinese Revolution. Under CCP intelligence, you had 3 rival organizations which actually competed with each other. They actually said they were competing with each other, and they tried to gain favor of Chiang Kai-shek. They were loyal to him, and he encouraged them to compete with each other. He played them off one against the other at times. The same thing was true in the military, where there were rival centers of power, some of which were loyal to Chiang Kai-shek and others of which were less loyal to him. There was a great deal of emphasis on assassinations of not only of the Japanese and their toadies, but also of opposition, peaceful opposition within the KMT-controlled areas. People would be leaned on, and then, as if it were an episode of The Sopranos, they would be eliminated, sometimes publicly. And one aspect of this was that public elimination of enemies seems to have been intended to show the public who was boss. There was very little secrecy about this. The disadvantage to this approach was a lack of coordination. The advantage was there were no communist-style disruptive political campaigns to find enemies within. Not as many, anyway. They weren't the same, in other words. There was always fear of communist infiltration, and indeed, by the end of World War II and going into the Civil War, the nationalist side was riddled with communist spies, particularly once people began to see which way the wind was blowing. Once 1947, for example, dawned and the nationalists began to lose, and they did nothing but lose, then more and more of their officials began to look for ways to hedge their bets, to establish ties with the Communist Party and provide them with information in order to protect themselves after the revolution was over with. By contrast, on the communist side, things were not all sweetness and light, that's for sure. One of their big problems was Mao Zedong's paranoia, which was driven by some actual concerns of enemy infiltration, that is, not only Japanese, but nationalist Chinese infiltration. We'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. But there were periods of time I did not cover in any detail. I think I only mentioned that there was a terrible campaign in 1931, for example, which is referred to by historians as the Fujian Incident. And you can find out about Fujian simply by doing a research, a web search on the topic. So I'm adding that in now. I can't do 2 things at once. Wish I could. If I could, I'd be in a much higher paying job, I'm sure. Okay, so I just put in reference Fujian Incident on this slide 18. Mao Zedong was a paranoid dude. There's no doubt about that. And he became more and more paranoid, and with a difficult personality and a violent one as time went on. But this was one of the most difficult aspects of his administration, was his belief that people who professed loyalty to him, and after 1942, that's all they did when he gained full control of the party, that people who professed loyalty to him actually wanted to see him out of the way. Again, I can't help thinking about Tony Soprano here. I assure you I studied China before I studied Tony Soprano. But an advantage of the way the communists ran their intelligence organization was that they had central political oversight by one committee. It was dominated by Mao Zedong, either directly or through a gentleman named Kang Sheng, who we will discuss shortly. But everything was centrally controlled, unlike on the KMT side where everything was all messed up and people were competing against each other, and Chiang Kai-shek was engaging in divide and rule tactics. There was also more emphasis on espionage itself rather than going around and popping people off. They did have their period, especially in 1943, 1931 and 1943 were the two bad years, not only for CCP intelligence, but for the party in general, where the intelligence people were being used as if they were a Stalinist secret police. Not as many people, perhaps, were killed, although that's the subject of a lot of research and controversy, but as in Russia. But the point is that these periods were relatively short-lived. On the nationalist side, terrorizing one's own population was a continuing vocation. Let's go on to slide 19. Another contrasting aspect on the military side was guerrilla operations behind the lines. The KMT special operations, you can read about them in Taylor, were like something out of Rambo. They were well trained. They were trained by the OSS people, the Office of Strategic Services people from the U.S., and by the Navy. You may recall the Navy have this organization called the SEALs, but I'm sure you've heard of them. So the Navy helped to train, and the OSS helped to train KMT Special Ops, and they were like out of a movie. They would parachute in, shoot them up, and exfiltrate out. They did not become involved with support from the population. The communists, on the other hand, were completely the opposite. They came into areas, tried to set up local governments. They swam like fish, as Mao used to say, swam like fish in water amongst the peasantry, and were ultimately more effective because they had further reach and had more staying power in the countryside. And they were enemies of each other and fought each other when they encountered one another. Going on to slide 20, the Americans were getting impatient because things seemed like they were bogged down in China in 1944, as we'll see in a slide that I think is coming up. And as you can see in one of the videos that's on tap for this week, China was the one place in the world where the Axis powers were still on the offensive. Indeed, the Japanese continued. One reason why the Americans were able to make the progress they did in the Pacific was that the Japanese had not given up on China. They kept a lot of people there, and they continued to try to push toward Chongqing, or Chongqing, the nationalist capital. The Americans were getting impatient. They could see that the nationalist Chinese were trying to preserve their forces for the fight that would come afterwards with the communists, and the Americans wanted to win the war. That was what they were all about. They were all about getting the war over with and defeating the Axis as quickly as possible. And so their thinkers the American strategists began to wonder about the communists, what they were doing, whether or not they were effective against the Japanese, whether arming them, as the Americans were arming the nationalists, would bring about a speedier end to the war. And quite frankly, the Americans were somewhat hoodwinked by Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai at this time was leading the liaison office in Chongqing, the nationalist capital, and he had regular contact with resident Americans. He was, in effect, like a diplomat. The nationalists followed these guys around, and sometimes they'd follow one down a dark alley and kill him. But believe me, the communists were no more merciful. But the point is that they knew they couldn't harm Zhou Enlai, even though they spent a lot of time following him around as if he were a Chinese diplomat in Washington, D.C. today. It is what it is. So, among the people who became familiar with Zhou Enlai was Theodore White. Teddy White later went on to write the books that you can find in our library on the American political elections, The Making of the President, 1968, The Making of the President, 1972, and so on. Teddy White spoke Chinese, and he had been living in Chongqing for several years, covering, I think he was working for Time magazine at the time, and he and some other Americans who were there, including John Service, he's in this photograph wearing the garrison cap there in the background, and tie. John Service and others, John Davies, working for the State Department or the Defense Department, frankly became enamored with the Chinese communists and believed all the propaganda that they were being fed about how the Chinese communists were making great efforts behind the lines against the Japanese. They were making great efforts behind the lines. They did pop off the occasional Japanese collaborator or officer. However, they had gotten a bloody nose in a campaign in 1941 against Japan. It was called the 100 Regiments Campaign, and they attacked the Japanese, and they inflicted heavy casualties on them in northwest China. But then the Japanese decided that they weren't going to put up with that, and the communists lost the equivalent of a couple divisions in the retribution that followed. And so Mao Zedong decided that he wouldn't be doing that anymore. This was right about the time of the New Fourth Army incident, where the nationalists attacked a couple of Chinese divisions under the New Fourth Army. And so these well-timed historical events led Mao Zedong to conclude that expending a lot of troops fighting the Japanese was probably not a great idea. But this romance that occurred for about a year eventually evaporated as Mao concluded that the United States was, in spite of how badly the U.S. and Chiang Kai-shek got along, he concluded eventually that the United States was never going to leave. I could bring about a marital analogy here, but I won't. Analogy. The Americans would never leave that old Chiang Kai-shek, not the least for political reasons at home. Going on to slide 21, let's talk about some of those problems. And there were many. The efforts of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Song Mei-ling notwithstanding, there were enormous political problems in this alliance between the Americans and Chiang Kai-shek, and I don't want to read them all to you because I'm taking too long as it is here, I think, but suffice it to say that Chiang Kai-shek and his command felt that they had already taken enormous casualties fighting the Japanese up to this point, and they could see that the communists were growing stronger, and they could see what might happen after the war. So basically, they decided to try to get as much military aid as they could and preserve their forces. However, the Americans wanted to win the war. At first, in 1943, for example, there was this Cairo conference where Chiang Kai-shek was a major participant. However, at Yalta, which 2 years later, where the Russians, the British, and the Americans decided how World War II would end, Chiang Kai-shek was not invited. And this told him that things were not good with the alliance, as if he didn't already know that. And it's important to realize, by the way, that the outlook of the decision makers at the time did not include the brainwave that Japan would suddenly surrender in August of 1945. The Manhattan Project was a very well-kept secret. Of course, Roosevelt and later Truman knew about it, but Truman didn't know about it until he became president. Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project while he was vice president. That's how secret it was. Certainly, Chiang Kai-shek had no idea about the Manhattan Project. Churchill did, because his scientists were participating. However, most people who were planning the end of the war believed that the United States would have to invade Japan at great cost, even with the atomic bombs being deployed. So people weren't assured that things were going to end all that quickly. Let's go on to one other aspect, slide 22, of the U.S.-China alliance, and that is the very interesting historical figure, General Joseph Stilwell. Stilwell was brought in. He was the best friend of General George C. Marshall, who at the time was Chief of Staff. He was the head of the Joint Chiefs. In other words, he was the top military man in the United States, and he was Roosevelt's, I say FDR here, of course, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was Roosevelt's chief military advisor, best friends with Stilwell. Stilwell, a West Point graduate. I don't know if he was a classmate of Marshall's, but Stilwell was a fluent Chinese speaker. He had spent a lot of time in China. He had not had as much military command time as most officers of his rank. And the difference of opinion, I think, between these two people, Chiang Kai-shek and Stilwell, who was made chief of all Chinese, the commander of all Chinese forces in Burma at the time, the main difference between them was that Stilwell wanted to deploy his well-trained divisions and kick the Japanese out of Burma as quickly as possible, in line with the U.S. goal of ending the war as soon as possible. Chiang Kai-shek, on the other hand, could see that the Americans had taken a lot of time and trouble to train and arm these divisions. He was thinking that they would be very useful to him after the war in fighting the communists, and he remembered what happened to his well-armed, well-trained divisions that he threw against the Japanese in Shanghai, Nanking, and so on. Earlier in the war, they were ground up like mincemeat. So he didn't want that to happen, and he kept intervening between Stilwell and the commanders who were supposed to be working for him in the Chinese army. That's a very simplistic summary, but I don't think it's inaccurate. And Stilwell began to have a great deal of trouble with Chiang Kai-shek. I've put an image of the Planters mascot, Mr. Peanut, here because that's what Stilwell called Chiang Kai-shek in private and in his diaries. And there's a lot of this. There was an interesting book by Barbara Tuchman called Stilwell and the American Experience in China, which our author Taylor does not like very much. Taylor, I have to say, is pretty sympathetic with Chiang Kai-shek. But one reason why I assigned that book in spite of that is that I don't think he's too far off the mark. Let's go on to slide 23 in the next recording.